Hey, what's up, you guys? Hope you're doing well. So it's quite late where I am right now, but I've been playing around with the new responsive engine for a while, and I thought it would be cool to record a video in which I try to redesign some sort of interface and test out this new responsive engine and also learn about it in real time because I'm very much still figuring it out as well. I've been playing around with it for quite some time now, and I feel like I'm getting the hang of it, but um, well, we'll see how I do. And there's still a lot to learn, I'm sure. So if you see me doing something in this video that doesn't make sense, that you think would make more sense to do in a different way, please do let me know. But what I wanted to build in this video together is this interface right here, this messaging interface. In part because building something like this previously using the old responsive system was incredibly difficult to do. Anything that required sort of a conditional screen height, you could do it, but it was very painful and often involved a lot of tricky code to do. So let's get started. Let's see how we can build something like this using the new responsive engine. I'm going to go into the editor. And the very first thing that I'm going to do, I created this brand new page called messaging. It's completely blank. Of course, the first thing that we need to do is click on upgrade to responsive to the new system. I'm going to be going through everything that is not related to the new responsive engine really quickly. So if you're brand new to Bubble and you see me kind of racing through things, if you're brand new to Bubble, this is probably not the best video for you to watch. This is just exploring the new responsive engine. Anyways, I have this blank page here, and looking at this interface here, here's how I'm thinking about it right now. I have this row on top that is the header. And inside of the header, we have this logo on the left. We have this message title in the center here, and these other two text elements on the right side. And then underneath that header, I have these two columns here. So the column on the left has all of these conversations that scroll down on the left side, right? And on the right side here, whatever conversation is active, we have the messages right in front of our face here. And also, I'm including in this column on the right, we also have this input and this send button as well. So we'll include that in the right column. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the new responsive engine is, for me at least, it's forcing. I think it forces one to start planning out your interface a little bit more in advance like this, and to start thinking about things in terms of rows and columns. Whereas before, with the previous responsive engine, you could very quickly just drag and drop things onto the screen and kind of worry about how everything's going to fit together afterwards. With this new responsive engine, it does require a little bit more planning, I think. Another thing that we'll get into this, we'll get into everything after in a moment, I promise. But another thing that's interesting that I found about this new responsive engine is that I think it's much more flexible in terms of how you get to something that looks like this. So there are probably a number of different approaches that one could take to build something like this. I'll show you what I would do, at least at this moment in time. So we have this blank page here, and let's start by changing the width of the page. So I'm going to change it to 1280 pixels. And I am going to set the container layout to be a column. The reason for that is because I want essentially these, I'm going to have two rows. So the first row, like we said, is this header here. And then I'm going to group these two columns together to make up the second row. So columns are going to stack on top of each other. This will make more sense in a second. So the container layout for the page that is called messaging, we've set to be a column. And the first thing that I'm going to do is drag a group here across the page. And this is going to be our header group. So let's call this group header. Now, inside of this group, this is going to be a row. So we're going to have some stuff on the left here, the logo, the title, like we said, and some text elements, and they're going to be spaced apart inside of a row. So I'm going to set the container layout, instead of fixed, this is going to be set to row. One thing that confused me too is this container layout. This applies to how elements inside of this group, inside of group header here, how they are aligned inside of the group. So this is not the actual group header in relation to the page. It's the children of group header and how they behave inside of this group. Okay. So let's first change the background color of this group so that we can see it a little bit better. I know that it's in the real one, it's white here, but just while we're building everything out, let's start changing the color. Okay, so inside of this group header, we have, I'm just going to put one logo here for now. So we'll just say a single image. On the left, we'll have this text element called messages, and then we have these two text elements that I'm going to group together and they'll be aligned to the right-hand side of the page. So let's start dragging these elements in. I've got an image here, and I did download at least something that had the letter Q in it. So we'll put that here. We have another text element. And notice how when I start dragging and releasing these elements, notice how they kind of, they snap to one another, and they're trying to fill up this entire row here. And if there's no more space, like if I just kept copying and pasting this text element, for example, inside of this group, notice how it eventually drops to that next line, right? And this group will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's just trying to fill up the space that it has here. Okay, so let's change this to say messages. And we'll center this. Make it a little bit bigger too. And now inside of this group, I'm going to have another group, and this group here, let's call this group right side. I'm not the greatest at naming my elements on the best of days, so I'm exhausted right now too. So you'll probably see some poor naming choices for groups. But anyways, inside of here, we'll put the download app and the logout text element. So we'll say download app. And because I haven't changed this group either, this is all, right now if I double click on group right side and I go to the layout, you can see it's fixed, which is why I can kind of drag everything around, and this more so resembles the old system. But we'll change that in a second because I don't actually want this group to be fixed at all. And this will say, I think it just said logout. So we'll say logout. So we have everything that we need here. And let's make this a little bit more pretty now. So the first thing is I want this group right here, group header, to stretch all the way across the page. So if I go into layout, you can see right now that when I dragged it onto the page, Bubble automatically said make this fixed width, and it set the width to 986, which is just what I dragged out onto the screen. I don't actually want this to be fixed width. So if I uncheck this and I say that the minimum width, let's just change this because we don't really need a minimum width right now. Then you can see that this group header right here is just fitting to, it's only taking up as much width as it needs to, right? If I were to, for example, if I were to cut this group out, you can see that it actually shrinks down to whatever content it has here. Now, because I've made this group header a row, one of the things that I can do is I can align it in relation to its parent. And one of the things that we have here available to us is this horizontal stretch. So I can make this group header stretch all the way across the page like this. And remember before how we said that up here, when we're dealing with the container layout, which is a row, and the container alignment, what we're actually doing is we're dealing with the elements that are inside of group header, so the children elements here. And what I want to do is I want to determine how these are going to be aligned inside of group header, all of these children. Right now, you can see the container alignment is to the left, and that makes sense. All of these elements are kind of aligning to the left side of this group, right? But one of the options that we have is I can space them evenly. So I think that is this one right here. And now you can see that even though things aren't perfect, we need to deal with that in a moment. But you can see that there's an even amount of space between this element here and this element as well. Okay. So now let's deal with these two right here. First of all, let's just change the font. Looks like these are smaller and a little and gray. So let's make these maybe size 15. Let's not worry about the alignment right now because I want to see if we can just fix that with these layout options that we'll look at in a second. But we'll change the font weight to 500 and maybe a little bit of a darker gray. Do the same here. So these text elements too, if I go to the layout here, actually the first thing I want to do, I said, is I want to change the actual, this group right here, group right side. I don't want this to be fixed. I'm going to change this to be a row as well. Okay, and you can see the second that I do, these text elements up here, they jump up to the top and they go to the left side, right? Because inside, again, if I click on this group right here, we can see that I changed this to a row and the container alignment is to the left. So all of the elements here will try to snap to the left and take up as much space as they need, right? Now, let's see what we can do here. So the first thing is I don't actually want this to be fixed width, this logout text element. It's set to fixed width right now. And a lot of these, at least what I've found as I've gone through and done things with this new responsive engine, is a lot of the time when you drag a element onto the page, the default settings, if you're doing what I'm doing here, are not what you'd want. Bubble makes a lot of the stuff just fixed width. And very often, in my case, at least the way I'm approaching it, you don't want it to be fixed width. So I'm going to uncheck this. We'll do that. And I'm going to uncheck this as well because I don't want either of these to be fixed width. Okay. What I do want is I want to fit the width to the content here. I want the text element to actually fit to the amount of text that we have, right? So I'm going to check this and we'll say fit to content. And I'm going to do the same with log out here. There we go. So now we can see that these text elements are nicely fitted. And why don't we do the same with this group right here? So instead of, you can see again, if I click on group right side and we look at the layout settings, you can see that right now it's taking up all this room because it's set to be a fixed width of 333 pixels, which I don't want. So if I uncheck this, the default behavior, let's get rid of this minimum width. The default behavior is to stretch and try to take up as much room as it can, but we don't want that either, obviously. I only want this group right side here, to take up as much width as it actually needs. So I'm going to also check fit width to content. And now this is starting to look a little bit better, but we still need to fix a few things. So obviously, first of all, these text elements are way too close to one another. It'd be nice if they had a little bit of margin here. And one of the things that we have available to us now with this new responsive engine is this margin property. So let's first of all give a little bit of breathing room between group right side here and the edge of the page. So with this group right side selected, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. You can see that we have these margins right here. So let's just say that we want the right margin to be, I don't know, 20 pixels. And for logout here, let's say that I want a left margin of 12 pixels so that we have a little bit of space now between them. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to do is I want to align this in the center. If we go back here, it looks like these are perfectly aligned in the center. It looks like there's quite a bit of margin between them too, actually. So let's increase the margin there. And again, there's probably like a number of different ways to do this, right? Make the group bigger and space them differently inside of here as a row, but this works for now. So let's just leave that. Let's give it even more. Okay. Now this group here, you can see that right now the minimum height is set to 41. If I were to change this to, let's say, like 50, you can see it increases in height a little bit, right? Let's do that one more time, right? 41 to 50. What I want to do is I want to make this group stretch all the way vertically, right? And we can see right now that we have this vertical alignment property. And so I'm going to say that instead of aligning to the top and having a minimum height of 50 pixels, I'm going to say stretch all the way to the bottom. Actually, why don't we do this instead of that? I don't think that's the best way to do it. Why don't we do this? We'll say that we want to align it in the center here, and we don't really care about this minimum height. So get rid of that. And now you can see that, again, the group automatically shrinks to the minimum height that it needs. And now we have a perfectly centered group like this, which is great. It's exactly what we want. Let's do the same with this. So if I click on messages here, first of all, I don't really care about this fixed width of 407 pixels. So we will say, don't be fixed width, and this starts to expand, which is great. And then we'll say center vertically. Same with this image here. Now, images are a little bit tricky. I haven't really figured them out fully in this new system in terms of how resizing works. Videos also, they look, I need to do some more work there. But one of the things that's interesting with this image here is I can say keep aspect ratio. And I know from downloading this image that this image is a square, right? So the width is the same as the height. And now it looks like a proper image, like I downloaded, which is great. Let's give it a little bit of margin from this left edge as well. So looking at this group here, I said 20 pixels from the right side. Let's do the same here. We'll say 20 pixels from the left. You can see that everything starts to shift over. Okay. So I think that's good for now. Let's keep going. Let's change this back to, let's see how we're doing here. Let's change this back to white. And we'll give it a little bit of a border on the bottom. Okay, I don't think this is perfectly centered, and I maybe want to come back and play with that a little bit later. But for now, I think let's move on and not worry about it too much right now. Okay, so far so good. Let's start dealing with the rest of this. Now, like I said, we have two columns that we need to deal with here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a group, and let's just drag this group onto the screen here. And this group is going to hold both columns. So we can think about this group that's going to hold this left column and the right column together, which are also going to obviously be groups. But this first group that I just dragged onto the screen I'm going to go to layout, and instead of making it fixed, I'm going to give this I'm also going to make this a row. Okay. And for now, let's drag a group in here. We'll call this group left column. Let's make it gray. And I'm just going to copy and paste that. And we'll say group right column. Okay. And let's give this a little bit of a darker color. So I obviously want this group to span the entire width of the page. And the left column, we can see looking here that this is going to be, significantly less wide compared to the right column, right? The right column looks like it takes up maybe 3/4, 75% of what the left column does, around there anyways. So if I go back to the editor, first let's make this stretch all the way to the edge of the page. So if I double click here and I go to layout, let's call this group messaging container. Greatest name, but that's okay. We can see that this group messaging container is fixed width. So let's uncheck that. We won't worry about minimum width 2. Get rid of that. And this shrinks down. And we're going to do the same thing that we did up here with this group. I'm going to say that for group messaging container, I want to stretch this I want to make it take up as much space as it can inside of its row. So we'll stretch it all the way like that. Okay. That looks good. And let's say that we want this group right here, this column, to have a minimum width of, let's change this again to, if we look at what we want the container layout to be, so how we want the children of this group to behave, we're going to have a repeating group in here. So there's just going to be things stacked on top of each other. So I'll say that I want this to be a column. We could actually probably just put a repeating group here. We wouldn't even need a group, but I like grouping things together. Maybe I'll start doing that less with this new responsive system because we won't really need to as much. Before, groups, they're nice for organization, but you also really needed groups to deal with a lot of the responsive stuff. Whereas I think they'll be less necessary, but we'll see as we go along here. Anyways, I'm going to say that I don't want this to be fixed width. You can see instantly it tries to take up as much space as possible here. So let's change the minimum width. What we'll say is we want a maximum width here. Let's actually go back and make this fixed width. And let's just say that the width is going to be 400 pixels. Okay. And for this group right here, the right column, we want this to also, the children of this group are also going to be inside of a column. They're just going to be kind of stacked on top of each other, right? So we have a repeating group here for all of the messages, and then we're going to have this input on the bottom, a group on the bottom of these messages. So I'll uncheck this and say that it's not fixed width, and there we go. Now you can see that things are looking a little bit, we'll deal with the repeating groups obviously in a second, but we at least have that layout that we want here. It's starting to look like that at least. Okay. So why don't we deal with this left side first? And another thing that I want to do here actually, before we do that, is I want, this is one of the coolest things in my opinion about this new responsive engine, is before, it was such a pain to try to figure out how tall to make your elements for something like this. I actually, not so long ago, built an entire repeating group with just an HTML element to solve that one problem. that because you didn't know what the user's viewport height would be, so it was such a pain to do, to try to make your elements expand to the proper height. But we don't really need to worry about that. At least it's much less of a problem than it was in the older system. So what we can do here is, even though the page minimum height is 600, for this group right here, if I right now it's we're saying fit height to content for this group, and we also have a minimum height of 456. So watch what happens if I delete this minimum height. We're going to see that group shrink up to try to fit its content, which is what we've seen before, what we did over here, right? Now we're dealing with a column. Before we were dealing with an actual row, right? So if I uncheck this, then you can see that it tries to take up as much vertical space as it can. And I can do the same thing with these two groups here. I can say, don't worry about a minimum height. Or sorry, actually, we have this vertical alignment property here that I can change. And I can make this row stretch vertically to take up as much height as possible. Let's do the same right here. And before we do anything else, why don't we actually just preview this to see what it looks like. And let's take debug mode off. And look at that. We have this full vertical height, 100% of the viewport. And I mean, this is amazing for all of you guys who have been bubbling for a long time to just be able to do something like this. This was a major challenge before, without using a bunch of different hacks. Anyways, let's keep going. So inside of here, we're going to put a repeating group. And one of the things that is quite different about the new responsive engine is how we actually deal with repeating groups, which is also really cool. So take a little water break there. Now this repeating group, I don't think I'm going to make anything fixed inside of this walkthrough. And the more I play around with it, the less I actually make things fixed. I'm really curious to see how other people play around with this, because maybe I'm way off. Maybe it's more powerful to use a fixed layout at times. But anyways, let's keep going. So I'm going to uncheck make this element fixed width. And I want this repeating group to stretch horizontally to fill its container here. Okay. I'm also not too concerned about a minimum height or a minimum width for that matter, but the minimum width shouldn't be affected anyways, because this should be fixed width. The container, I mean. Inside of the cells container, though, this works the exact same as any other container layout, right? We're just dealing with what we want the layout of this cell to be here. And I don't want this to be fixed. Instead, I'm going to set this to be, let's set it to be a row. And yeah, I think that's what we want here. Yeah. Okay, let's try that. Let's see how we go. Okay. And what we'll do here is I'll put a group inside of here. And this group is also going to be a row. So the children of this group. Now, what I'd like to do with these repeating groups, at least right now, is to make them stretch vertically to fill the entire cell, and then to give this group a little bit of margin to deal with the space in between different cells. So I'm gonna let's give this a background color so we can see. So we'll say group conversation container. And I'm going to go to the layout and make this stretch all the way. And what I'll do is we'll go down and we'll say, let's just give it a bottom margin of 8 and a top margin of 8 as well. We'll center it. Oh, no, sorry. We'll stretch it out. And we won't make this fixed width either. And one of the things that we can do now, which is so cool in the Appearance tab, is I can, for this repeating group, I can uncheck set fixed number of rows here. So right now we have 4 rows. Before we had to pick how many rows and columns we wanted. But I can say that I don't want a fixed number of rows here. And what we'll do now is we can also say that the layout of this, how do we do this before? We're saying fit height to content. Let's just uncheck this. And now you can see that this repeating group is just going to kind of, it'll be like a proper vertical scrolling one that just scrolls down as much as you need it to, right? And we won't worry about a min height or anything like that. That doesn't really matter. But so far, so good. All right. Sorry, I had to pause there and take a little break, take a little refresher. One thing that I should say too is what I've done for these repeating groups, again, just so that we can focus entirely on the new responsive engine, is I've gone into my database here and created a conversation type and a message type. I've just created these types for the sake of being able to create some sort of dummy data so that we can actually see the repeating groups show up here. So if we look into the database here, you can see that I have a bunch of different messages here that are just totally blank entries in the database just so they'll show up. So on the left here, what we'll do is the type of content, I'll set this to conversation. We'll just do a search for all conversations. And I'll do the same when we get to messages over here. But let's start actually designing out the first cell of what we want this to look like. So we're going to have an image here, and then we're going to have the name of the person that we're speaking to, a preview of the message down here, and then the actual time or the date that it was sent. So the way that I want to do this again is using a row here. So let's go back here, and we're going to set the layout to a row, which is perfect. It'll be aligned. The children of this group will be aligned to the left. And let's start with an image. Okay. So for this image, let's make a static image that looks like this. We'll give it a little bit of roundness. And let's make this a little bit bigger too. Why don't we just say 60 by 60? For the vertical alignment, we want it to be vertically aligned like this. And let's give it a little bit of margin here as well. So we'll say, I don't know, 16 pixels from the left. Okay, now when I look at something like this, we have the name here and then the time, and they're on the same level too, right? They're on the same row. So why don't I put a group and group these two together, and then we'll have the preview of the actual message outside of that group. So we'll do a group like this, and then inside of that group, we'll do another group for the name of the person and the message, and then a text element underneath here as well. Okay. And this text element will be for the preview of the message, of course. So I'm going to double click on this group. Inside of this group, what do I want? I want these to actually be a column, I think, right? So because we're going to have a group and then a text element underneath it. So I'll say that the layout for this, let's just say, let's call this group conversation info. So instead of making this fixed, I'll make this a column. Okay. And for this, let's center it again vertically into its parent. And we're not going to be worried about the fixed width here. Instead, what we'll do is we'll give it a little bit of right margin. This is what I mean again by like, there's probably so many different ways to set this up, right? I'm not sure if this is the best way yet. Not sure at all. Still figuring this out, obviously, as you can see. But we'll give this a little bit of margin, 16, 16. And then in here, what we'll do is I'll copy this text element. I'll paste it in the group here. This is going to be the name of the person. This is going to be the preview of the conversation. So let's just make this text look a little bit more accurate, a little bit more like the original. Say this is going to be regular 15. It's going to be much darker. And let's just copy and paste some lorem ipsum. Let's leave it and try to deal with that in a second. And this will be the name, user. And inside of here, we'll have one more text element. Let's go back. So the one thing I want to change about this group right here is the layout style, because I want this group to actually be a row, right? Because we're going to have two things on this, two elements on this line. So I'll change this from fixed to row. And now watch what happens if I copy and paste this. Because presumably, because yeah, right, both of these text elements are set to fixed width, and there's right now the width is 181 pixels. There's not enough space on this line for two text elements that are both 181 pixels to exist. So one has to drop down to the next line, and this group becomes bigger. Instead, we'll uncheck this. We'll uncheck this as well. And what we'll say is we don't want this minimum width here. We don't care about that. And you can see now that this jumps up to the next line. For this one, we want this to stretch all the way. Actually, no, we don't. What we do want is inside of this. So why don't we get rid of this minimum width for this particular text element? And what we do want is we want both of these text elements to fit to their container, right? So for this one right here, I'm just going to say fit width to content so that the container actually shrinks down to only take up as much text as we need. And I'll do the same for this. Fit width to content. And why don't we change this right now so that this looks a little bit less ridiculous? This is going to be the date, let's say. It's much smaller. Doesn't see this text alignment right here doesn't really actually matter with how we're going to set it up. So make this a little bit darker. And what we'll do is for this group right here, first of all, I don't want it to be fixed width. So if I go to this layout and I uncheck this, and I don't really care about the minimum width, what we'll do is we'll stretch it all the way to the end of the group here. And then inside of this group, this is where we can start playing around with the container alignment here, because this group right here, let's just call this group name and date. This group name and date, the container layout's a row, right? So we have these different layout options here. And what I want is we'll use the same one that we used up here. We use this space between. I think I could also, no, yeah, we're going to use that space between, which moves this all the way over to the left, this all the way over to the right, and perfect. That's what we want, right? Let's also give this group a little bit of margin from the left or from the right edge of this image. So we'll say 16 pixels. Oops, don't like that. Let's say that the minimum width of this is not 294. I think that's why it jumped down to the next line, because it didn't have enough space there. So if I get rid of that, there we go. Okay. And what we'll do here is, again, we're not going to worry about this fixed width. We'll let that go. I think that, let's see. It looks like there only has one line here, right? That I don't think actually 2 lines looks bad there, but let's try to be consistent. Let's say we only want 2 lines. So I think what we have to do in this case is actually set a maximum height here. Let's set a maximum height of 24 and see what that does. Okay, that actually worked perfectly. So this text element should not get, we'll just make this a fixed height of 24. This should not get any higher than that. And what we'll do here is we'll stretch this out as far as we can too. One of the weird things that I've noticed before with text elements or with this new responsive engine is before we used to have these properties for text elements that were cut off if the text gets longer, shrink if they get shorter. Wonder if that's still true with see if I change this to fixed and I look at this text. No, maybe they're in a different place. I can't see them anywhere though. So that's kind of one thing that was confusing for me as I was going through this new responsive engine is before we used to cut off the vertical height of text or shrink it. Now it appears like the way that I just did it here was I set a fixed height so that anything like, let's say that, this message, this is representing a message in the interface that we're building out was super long. We'd set the height to be fixed or at least a maximum height of 24 pixels here, which would only allow for one line. So that seems to be working. And yeah, I mean, so far so good. I think that works pretty well. Let's change the background color of the group behind this repeating group, or the parent, let's call it, because it's driving me a little crazy. And there we go, right? And if I preview this, let's get rid of debug mode again as well. Look at that. That's pretty cool, right? This was like impossible, not impossible, but this was so hard to do with the previous responsive engine. So it's so nice to see something like this. Great work, Bubble Team. Very exciting stuff. Okay, and now let's deal with this on the right-hand side here. So let's go look at our original model again. I'm not going to worry about this up here. I'm trying to make that work. Okay, so let's start by just getting the 2 groups that we need here, because again, we have this repeating group for messages, right? Whatever active conversation I have selected here, I'm looking at the messages from that conversation. And then we also have this input on the bottom. And it's not just an input, there's an icon here. I'm not going to worry about the icon right now, but the input and then this send button as well. So let's make this, doesn't need to be so dark now. This is, I think actually, yeah, it is gray here though, so we'll leave it gray. And inside of here, we'll put a repeating group. And another group as well under the repeating group. So this we'll call group input container. Repeating group. This will be a repeating group for messages. And let's just do the logic right now. Why not? We're just doing a search for messages. And all right, let's deal with this now. So for this repeating group, what I want to do is I obviously want this to span the entire width of its container. So let's say that the layout for this is the cells container layout, but I don't want this to be fixed width, so I'll uncheck that. I don't care about a minimum width. And I'm going to use the same thing here. So, oops, where did that go? Okay, so you can see what happened there when I unchecked fixed width is that it collapsed down because there's no content in there right now. So it's literally just it's not taking up any space. But what I want to do is I want it to stretch all the way. I want to force it to stretch all the way across its row. So we'll do that. That looks good. And why don't I do this? Let's try to position this at the bottom of the screen right now. So I think what I can do is I think if I just uncheck fit height to content, what will happen is this will be pushed all the way down. Let's see if that does. Yeah, exactly. Right. So let's do that one more time. If I uncheck fit height to content, this is going to try to take up this repeating group is going to try to take up as much height as it can here. Right now, the minimum height is set to 286 pixels, which is why it's showing up here. But watch, if I'm guessing if I change this to 0, then we'll have the same thing happen that happened when we changed the minimum width. It collapsed down horizontally. We'll have the same thing happen vertically. And we do, like that, right? But we'll say fit height to content. We'll uncheck that. And the reason it's not going all the way down right here is because we have this group here called input container. Let's make this a little bit darker for now. Actually, let's just make it white. And we want this, of course, to stretch all the way across the page as well. So click on layout. I'm going to change the container layout also to be a row, but I'm not going to set a fixed width. So we'll get rid of that. And I'm going to force it to stretch all the way across its container. And what I want to do here as well with this repeating group is why don't we just set a little bit of top margin here, say 36 pixels, so that the repeating group doesn't, it's maybe a little bit too much. Just so that the messages don't go all the way into this input container here. Although maybe that wouldn't be the worst. I don't know. Anyways, you can do it or you don't have to, but that's what we can do with margin, which is pretty cool now. So let's change this repeating group to be a row. The cells container layout inside of the repeating group. So again, the first cell here, the layout for its children, we want to be a row. And I'm also going to say that I don't really care about having a fixed number of rows as well. Okay. Now let's grab, just for the sake of time here, I'm just going to copy and paste this group that we have here into this repeating group. Okay. And let's get rid of that minimum height. I don't really care about that for the row. And there we go. You can see that it shrinks down a little bit more, which is cool. So let's take a look at the original here. So we have a few things that we need to adjust. First of all, we don't actually need any of this stuff. So let's take this out. Let's get rid of that group. All we really need is the image. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a text element inside of a group here. And we'll change the background color of the group. So let's get rid of the background color. Actually, no, let's just make this a little bit darker. Sorry. Let's just leave it as white, actually. Okay. Actually, no, sorry. I know what we'll do. We'll make this no color. And what I'll do here is we'll take a group, put it inside of this group, and now I'll just copy this or cut and paste this text element inside of this group here. So we have that nice kind of background fill. And of course, as soon as I cut, oh, there's a group right here. Okay. So we'll paste this text element that I just cut inside of this group. And that didn't work out well. It looks like this group is, again, a lot of these are just kind of the default settings. We're getting used to them at least. So presumably this group right here is fixed, and I don't want that. Let's say that we want this to be a row, and we don't want it to be fixed width. And I don't care about the minimum width either. Okay, good. And now this text element is inside of this group right here. So let's change let's make this group white so that we can see things better, first of all. That looks good. And then let's change the width of this text element. So I don't need this to be so big, obviously. In fact, I just want this text element and the group as well. This is also just this was one of the things that you had to use some code for before, is to get that dynamic horizontal width, which we can do now natively with this new responsive engine, which is really cool. So I'm going to, let's see, go to layout here. I'm going to uncheck this as fixed width for this text element. And we'll delete the minimum width as well. Okay. So this is now stretching all the way to the end because it's trying to take up as much room as possible, the container for this text element. If I say fit width to content, which is what I want here, then that container shrinks down to take up only as much room as it needs. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with this parent group right here. So we'll say no minimum width, that's good, but we'll say fit width to content just like that. Perfect. And now inside of this text element here, what I'll do is I'll give it a little bit of margin. So let's say that this group, you can see right now the reason again that there's this little gap here is because of this minimum height. If I were to change this to like 45, for example, it drops down a little bit more. But I don't want this to have a minimum height. I want the height to just fit to the content. So we'll get rid of this. And now this group you can see is hugging the text element. And if with this text element selected, what I'll do is, let's get rid of the minimum height. I don't really care about that. What we'll do is we'll say that we would just want 8 pixels of margin on each side. Now we have this container that's looking a little bit better. Let's style this group a little bit. Maybe give it some roundness and some borders. And let's space it. Well, let's give a little bit of margin here for this image. Okay. And I think that's looking a little bit better. Let's preview this and just see how it looks. Yeah, so far so good, I think. Right, and we can scroll down just like that, which is super cool. We'll come back to this in a second, but why don't we get the easier part down here set up, which is the message container, the input container rather. So again, as you guys can see, and just this video has been going on for quite some time now too, and it's getting super late here. So I'm going to skip a lot of like the styling stuff here. One thing that I will say, I don't think there's a way right now that I can see. There's no obvious way. Sorry, I just realized that this group is probably not entirely necessary. Let's just say fit width to content there. Anyways, one thing that is not obvious to me with the repeating group is how to conditionally change this alignment here. So obviously, like the way that a typical messaging interface like this works is if I type something and click send here, presumably this will show up on the right. my message, the latest one that I just showed. And so what we would want with this new responsive engine is to conditionally align the message depending on who sent it, right? So if someone other than the current user sent it, it would appear left aligned, just like all of these are here. But if the current user sent it, then we would want it to be right aligned here. Um, the way that, like, if we look at the layout here, you can see that this is more the container layout actually. So I don't know if that would be the one that we'd be concerned about. This is what we would want here. The cells container layout and the container alignment here. So let's actually see. If I go to the conditional tab, what we would want here is, let's just say when. Now this wouldn't work because we would want to have access to whatever the current cell's message is. Let's just see for a second. Current user is logged in. Yeah, there's no alignment or anything like that either that we have access to. So we could do this with CSS, something like this. We could force it again, but I don't know if the bubble team is working on something that exposes those states so that we can change the alignment of and accomplish something like this. But that would be a nice feature to have. Okay. Anyways, we'll leave that for now. And let's just deal with this input on the bottom here. So I'll put, let's deselect this. Let's first deal with this group input container. So for the layout style here, I do want this to be a row. That's great. And let's just put a multi-line input in here. We'll get rid of all of the styling so that it just looks completely, yeah, good enough. And then what else do we need? We need just a send button here, right? Let's just put a regular button in for now. And we'll say send message. Okay. So let's make this look a little bit better. What we'll do is we want this input to take up most of the room here. So we want, let's see, if we go to layout, I'm not going to have this be fixed width again. I do want to center this vertically inside of the row. But we'll uncheck this and let it stretch all the way to fill up as much space as it can. We'll get rid of this minimum width. For a height, would I set a height here? Yeah, I might just set a height, like a fixed height. Maybe, I don't know, 40. We'll give it a little bit of margin here on the left. Let's do 20 pixels there. And then with this button here, I would probably also give this a fixed width and a fixed height. The original has like a text element in here, so that would work. Or just a button that looks like a text. So that would work too. But I'd probably give this a fixed height. So we'll say, and a fixed width for that matter too. So let's say 100. Is that enough? I want this to come on one line. Actually, why don't I just change the text to say send message. Don't need that. And we'll change the height to be, let's say, also 40 pixels. And we want to align it vertically inside of the row as well. Okay. And that, I think, is looking pretty good, right? So, I mean, just being able to see how everything is vertically scrolling nicely, and we're not like, I'm at the bottom of the page here, right? I can't, there's nothing stacked on top of each other and collapsing like we used to do before. We can also, we haven't looked at this in this tutorial, but horizontally collapsing things, we can do that now too, which is super cool. But even just being able to, without some of the finer details here of like splitting up the left and right, like we talked about, but even just being able to do something like this, where this input group is always on the bottom of the viewport height is super cool. I mean, we haven't really been able to do this without code before. So great job, Bubble Team. Again, I think this is going to be massive in terms of the way that we build out Bubble applications going forward. So thank you for watching. I think that's everything that I wanted to show you here. It's obviously not a perfect replica of this, but close enough. I mean, the time part here that we've left off, hopefully at this point, it's easy how we would accomplish something like that. You might add that time here, group these two together, and set the layout to be a column. Anyways, we won't go into that. But yeah, of course, let me know if you have any suggestions or anything that you noticed here, or if anything's confusing, if you have questions about it too. Again, like I said, I'm still learning this stuff and figuring it out. But I'll be happy to answer any questions that I'm able to answer. And looking forward to seeing all of the cool stuff that everyone is going to build now going forward with this new responsive engine. So take care, you guys. Have a good night, and see you all later. Bye-bye.